In this chapter, we'll be looking at some basic jQuery effects. We're going to start with the hiding and showing of elements with a very simple jQuery method. I'll demonstrate with this finished file. So I mouse over what appears to be a header around this box of tips for eating out. However, when I mouse over the header, the cursor changes, and when I click, I hide the tips below. When I click again, I expose them. So if you've been developing in HTML or JavaScript or CSS for some time, you're probably familiar with this sort of functionality. And it's been accomplished in the past and is used often today. It's something that we used to call dynamic HTML. So you may be thinking, if we've been doing this for years with dynamic HTML, which is basically JavaScript, HTML, and CSS combined to create an effect like the one you've just seen, then you might think, what do we need jQuery for? Well, this just gives me another opportunity to talk about the power of jQuery in terms of writing code much faster. So while the simple answer is yes, we can do this with dynamic HTML, we can do this with JavaScript in the way that we've done it in the past. But if you've ever done that, you've probably wrestled with the amount of code that you have to write to make sure that your dynamic HTML effect is going to work across all browsers. So there's browser differences in the way that events are handled, and there's some browser differences in regards to CSS. But all of this is handled by your jQuery framework. So again, that's the beauty of jQuery. We get to invoke these very simple methods that hide the complexity of the code that's required to get these effects to work in all browsers. So on the one hand, it's similar to dynamic HTML, but it takes all those pain points out, and it just allows you to call a method that's been tested to work on all browsers. It makes a common API for you to work with. So let's open up our starter file and see how we can use this new jQuery method called the toggle method. And it's going to allow us to control the hiding and displaying of elements. You want to open the file called exercise_1.html, which you'll find in the Chapter 8 Working with jQuery Effects folder. At the very top, we've got a style tag that styles some of the elements on the page down here. So let's take a look at those elements. We've got an h1 tag and a paragraph, followed by a div whose ID is box. Nested inside that div, we have another div whose ID is box header. We close that div and create a third div whose ID is box content, and that contains the food tips. The box header contains the h1 tag that reads tips for eating out. Those divs are styled up here in the style section. The box div is given a width of 400 pixels, and the header inside of the box header div has got some basic style information for the font, as well as some padding, and the height of the box, which is 24 pixels. The box content is floated left, given a border, margins are removed, and a bit of padding is applied on all four sides. Now let's move on to the script block now, where you'll see the empty document ready event function. This is where we'll write the jQuery method called toggle. Before we write that call to the toggle method, let's make sure that the cursor changes to a pointing finger. This will give the user a visual clue that they can click on the header. So we need to locate that header, and we'll do that with jQuery as usual. That was a div, and it was called box header. So there's our jQuery, to which we want to invoke the CSS method of jQuery. And we pass to it the property and the value that we want to change in CSS. So the property is our cursor, and the value of the cursor property will be set to the pointer. Now we need to write the jQuery that accesses the same object, the div whose ID is box header, and make it clickable. So we'll take that same div, box header, invoke the click event, and pass to it the function that we want to execute. And that function is the toggle method. First of all, we have to identify what it is that we want to toggle. So remember, toggle is a method that's going to dynamically show and hide depending on the current state of the div, or whatever element. It doesn't have to be a div, so any element that we want to hide and show. So we access the element that we want to hide and show with jQuery, and that was the div that contained the actual food tips on it. It was called box content. So another div whose ID is box content becomes our jQuery selector. And then we simply invoke the method that we want, called toggle. So let's go ahead and we'll proofread this, and then we can save the file, and we'll test it in the browser. The first thing that you want to test is your cursor change. So remember, this area here is the box content, and you can see my cursor goes back and forth between the solid arrow and the I-beam when I'm over the text. I want to move the cursor now towards the header div, and I should see the pointing finger. But remember, we are also invoking the toggle function here, the jQuery toggle. So I'll go ahead and click that, and it dynamically handles the hiding of the content div. Click again, and it invokes a show. So in this video, we learned a very simple way to access a jQuery effect, and there are a huge amount of jQuery effects that you can play around with. So definitely, like the other exercises that we've done in previous chapters, you really want to continue to explore the jQuery framework and see what else we can do. There's a lot more than toggle. In a previous exercise, we used the jQuery toggle method to hide and display elements within the DOM. When I click the header row, the div below it collapses. When I click the header div again, it toggles back to display the contents, which are these tips for eating out. But you can see it's not very elegant. It simply goes away and then comes back on the toggle of the header div. But we can make this a lot more elegant, a lot more slick with some predefined jQuery effects. So within the jQuery library, we have these methods that allow us to animate this effect of hiding and displaying certain elements. So I'll show you the finished animation, and you can see that the effect itself is going to be very different. It's not going to be an instant hide and an instant show. By passing more arguments to the toggle method, you wind up with an effect that looks like this. So I'll click that header div again, and you can see we'll have an animation as it closes up and an animation as it opens again. And this is all accomplished by calling the same toggle method, but passing to it some additional arguments. So you can see we already have a document ready function. We're already responding to the document being loaded with some jQuery. Line 50, for example, sets the cursor to a pointer when the user is over that div whose ID is box header. We also are going to respond to the click function directly below, and this is where we'll animate the call to the toggle method. So you can see a series of commented steps here, and let's take a look at the document structure. We've got an outer div whose ID is box, followed by the short div, which is the header box that gets clicked, and then we respond to the click by taking the div directly below it, whose ID is box content, and we basically hide and show it. This is essentially what the toggle method does, but in this exercise we're going to pass some additional arguments to that method that'll invoke the animation. So you'll place your cursor underneath step 1, and we'll begin by accessing the div that we need. So we use the jQuery selector. In this case, what we're looking for is once again a div, but the div has the ID of box content. Remember, this is the div underneath the box header. Now we're going to go ahead and invoke the toggle method again. The difference is we'll be passing to it an argument to indicate, in this case, the speed of the animation. So in the previous exercise, we just called the toggle method. You saw how that worked. It just hide and show. But now we have the option to pass in this argument that represents the speed at which the animation is going to play that actually does the toggling of this div whose ID is box content. So we'll pass in slow as the one and only argument, and we'll go ahead and save and test this. And I'll go ahead and click that header div now, and you'll see that it is now animated. Now that may not be the animation that you expect, but there are other arguments we can pass to control this animation. So that's the first argument we're going to pass in there, which is the speed. And you saw the effect that that had. It didn't simply hide and show the element, but it animated the hiding and showing. Now let's go back and take a look at the other arguments that we can pass in here. So let's just swap it out for fast and save and test it. So you see the exact same animation, but obviously the speed is much faster. Let's return to our code, and this time we're going to place the cursor underneath the comment for step 2. And once again, we'll pass into the jQuery method the selector, which is the box header this time. So what we'll do differently here is simply call a different animated effect. So this one is fade out, and you notice we're also passing in the argument, which is duration or speed. So we're going to put in normal there, and to truly see this effect, let's comment out line 53. This way we're not doing the toggle effect at all, but only the fade out. And bear in mind the fade out now is on the box header, which is the part that we are responding to, the click. So let's save this, test it in the browser, and you can see that the fade out worked, but it worked on the div that was responding to the click, which was that box header div, and you saw that it faded out at a normal speed, and that's the argument we gave. Now let's try taking a look at both effects at the same time. So what we'll do is we'll remove the comments from the toggle effect. So the box content is going to continue to animate, but the box header is going to fade out as well. So there's nothing wrong with invoking two different effects on two different DOM elements, and that's exactly what we're doing here. So there's the box that is now going to get the fade. Box content gets the toggle. But if we set that to just the outer box, you'll see that that's what's going to get toggled now. So instead of the previous jQuery selector, we're now doing the toggle effect on the div whose ID is box. Remember, this is the outer div. So let's go ahead and save and test this. And the outer div receives the toggle. And that was very quick, but you could see the effect taking place. So there's nothing wrong with using several effects at once. In this case, we use the toggle and we use the fade out. Let's comment toggle now of the outer div and do the same thing for the box header. So we're going to remove the two effects and place our cursor underneath the comment for step 4. Again, using the jQuery method, we'll locate the content we want, which is the box content. That's the food tips. And we'll use an entirely different effect here. This one is called the slide toggle. And you can see that it's asking for duration. We're going to pass in slow, and you'll see now what happens during a slide toggle. You may have noticed the all done function there, which is empty. Don't worry about that. We're going to address that in a later exercise, so that won't be used here. So you can save and test this. Now remember, it's the tips below that get the slide toggle. So we have the top div, tips for eating out, the div directly below it, which are the actual bulleted lists of tips, and that is now getting an effect known as a slide toggle. So in this exercise, we've seen that we can take some simple methods of jQuery, such as the toggle method, and then easily provide animation arguments so that we can not only create the animation itself, but we can control it, and things like its speed and what exactly gets animated and so forth. I've opened up exercise 3.html, which you'll find in the Chapter 8 jQuery Effects folder. Our goal here is to learn how to call a function after an animated effect has taken place. You can see that we already have a document ready function in this file. And on line 50, we're changing the cursor to a pointer for this box header div. And directly below that, you have a response to the click of the box header. So this div here is our outer div, and that's the tips for eating out is our header div, and we have some content below that. So we'll be placing some more jQuery code inside of our function in order to animate the collapsing and expanding of that div. So let's take a look at those divs now. If we scroll down towards the bottom, you'll see there's an outer div called box, inside of which is the header div that we're responding to the click of, and the box content div, which will expand and collapse. So there's the outer div, the header, and the box content, which actually contains those tips for eating out. So that's what will collapse and expand. Let's go back up to our jQuery now, and we'll write the body of this function, which responds to the click of the box header that we were just looking at. So we're going to use some jQuery to acquire that part of the DOM, or the document object model, that we're trying to manipulate. So there's our jQuery method, and the tag that we're looking for, or the selector, is going to be the box content, which is a div. So we get div, and there's some of our divs inside the document. The one we're interested in is the box content. Now at this point, we want to invoke a method of the jQuery object now that we've acquired that part of the document we want. And this is called the slide toggle method. So we're going to pass to it the speed at which we want to toggle this div collapse in its expanded state. And so we're going to choose a slow speed for that. Now at this point, we want something to happen after that slide toggle animation is complete. So we could either write a function here, or we could simply reference the name of a function. So we're going to call an existing function, So I'm going to go ahead and type the name of that function in there. And you notice I'm just closing the parenthesis. I'm not really calling the function. On line 55, you can see the function allDone. It acquires a div called allDoneMessage and sets the CSS property of visibility to a value of visible. So let's locate the allDoneMessage div. You'll find it down here at the bottom of the document. There's the div we're looking for, and it consists of a paragraph which simply says all done. So if we take a look at how that's styled right now, by heading up to the CSS block, you can see a reference to the all done message. Among other properties, the important one here is that its visibility property is set to hidden, which means we won't see this div when we launch the web page. In addition, we won't see the all done paragraph because it sits inside of that div. Let's head back up to our code now, and let's take a look at what we've done. We're going to set the visibility property from hidden to visible. So we're basically swapping it from its initial state of hidden to its new state of visible, and this happens here by the reference to the function, which it looks like there's a typo here. It's not add done, it's all done. That's the name of the function that we want to call after our slide toggle takes place. So we've already set the animation up. It's going to happen at a speed of slow. And now what we've done is added to the fact that when it's done, all done runs. So let's go ahead and try that. There's the animation, and there's the appearance of the div that was initially hidden because its CSS visibility property was set to hidden, and it's now being set to visible by way of the function call that takes place after our slide toggle. Of course, if we toggle it back, we don't have any code there to now swap it back to hidden. But I think you know enough about jQuery right now, so I think I'll leave you to write that function on your own to hide that div when we go ahead and call that function again, or we toggle the effect, the animated effect of the box content div. So as you perhaps saw when we were typing that code, there's a lot of other arguments you can pass to these functions. Our goal in this lesson was to pass the argument which was a function that you wanted to execute after your animation took place.